Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Modern Sales Pros Masterclass, the blueprint to Quota, sponsored by the team at Concert. And today we're joined by Concert CEO and co-founder, Sanj Sanamapudi. And Sanj, you've been here a bunch of times. We love having you on. Before we jump into the background of Concert and share a little bit more about MSP, why not just catch up? It's been about a quarter since you've been on an MSP event. So anything new that you've picked up, any new skills or hobbies you've honed since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, or any culinary recommendations at JFK Airport?
Well, definitely get the sushi if you're walking around an airport anytime. It's a quick way to weight loss. Rich is teasing because I ate airport sushi and got food poisoning. But
and we're glad that you're here and you're back on your feet and you're recovered, because today's session is going to be phenomenal.
Yeah, and in terms of like new skills picked up, for those of you who've seen webinars that we put together on a Concert before, this content is a little bit different. So like we've really gone back to our data set and tried to understand trends in pipeline and how people can use pipeline to improve performance and predictability. So that's a useful skill, right?
I think that's a great skill, and I think it's something too that one of the things we always love about having Sanj and the team from Concert on is there's such a data-driven approach, which a lot of folks bring to the table. But Sanj, as a recovering chief financial officer, and as the leader of an organization that focuses as much on the person and some of the psychology behind why, it's not just here's the data, here's what you should do. It's a little bit more on the psychology of why. And this, I can tell you, Sanj, I've prepared for a lot of programming in our time together at MSP, and this is some of the most interesting that we've had, and I'm really excited to jump into it. So before we do, let me just maybe say a few words about MSP, Sanj. You can say a few words about Concert, and then we can jump in because we got a lot to get through today. For those of you who don't know, Modern Sales Pros is the host of today's event, and Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest community for revenue leaders. So those are folks that are in sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales enablement, and the related supporting disciplines. Our mission is to create an environment for our community members where they can answer the questions they may otherwise struggle to solve on their own. One of the amazing parts about our community, we've got about 20,000 members and growing, and we have representatives and folks that are in the community from a whole variety of organizations, about 6,000. So when you come to an event like what we have here today, when you engage in our online forum, or in the future when you come to an in-person event, you really do get the opportunity to get interesting perspectives from across the spectrum. And we also seek to bring it together amazing speakers like we have today with Sanj. And for those of you who maybe aren't members of our community, you will be invited to join afterwards. We do encourage you to do that, as it is free for our members. But as I said at the outset, today's content wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship from the team at Concert. I'll hand it off to Sanj, CEO and co-founder at Concert, to say a few words about Concert. Sanj? Oh. One more slide that I missed here. And next week, we do have a summit style event. This is a multi-day event that's covering a whole bunch of different topics, all related to and adjacent to generating pipeline. We've got everything from managing Generation Z millennials to how to compensate sales engineers to how the hell do you use science and data to forecast more accurately. And we'll encourage you to join that as well, and look forward to seeing you all there. Now, let me hand it off to Sanj for a few words about Concert. Sanj?
Thanks. Hopefully you don't have more secret slides in here. Oh, yeah, that's us. Thanks, Rich, and to the team at MSP. I'm Sanj, co-founder here at Concert. At Concert, we believe the world should commission smarter. And when we talk about commissioning smarter, it's really on kind of three levels. We've worked with neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists to understand how commissions actually drive performance. So a lot of how we normally think about commissions is you close this much, you get paid this much. But it turns out, depending on how you're paying people and how you're reporting to people, you can drive better performance. And our platform does that through ways. The first is we give teams real-time feedback on their commissions and quota attainment. The second is we give analytics on helping set smarter targets. And the third is we help you interpret your pipeline and understand how to drive performance through pipeline. So today's content is really around what we call the blueprint to quota. We're going to go through kind of 4 key areas and then open it up to questions, as this is a pretty different topic for a lot of folks. And you know, for me, it was really eye-opening on how much you can actually drive performance through behavior change. So we'll explain what we mean by a blueprint to quota. We'll explain how you can use our handy Google Sheet tool that we've created to help you build your own blueprint, and then talk about how you actually operationalize that blueprint. And then finally, we'll go over a few key takeaways and then open it up for questions. So many of you who've registered asked the same question: what is the blueprint to quota? So our view on a blueprint to quota is telling your team what they need to do and when they need to do it in order to hit quota. So oftentimes when I've assigned quota in the past, or when I've seen other sales leaders assign quota, it's you need to close, say, $150,000 this quarter. Full stop. And what's missing in that is actually telling someone what they need to do to get there and how they know before the end of the quarter if they're on track or off track. So when we talk about the blueprint to quota, it's really going through the specific sales stages and the typical timing that needs to happen in order to convert by the end of the quota period. So one way to kind of help you guys understand like our point of view on this a little bit more is we took like a really kind of supply chain operational view on how you achieve targets. So imagine you're a car manufacturer and your goal is really like completing cars and delivering them to lots. Well, you know that there are a bunch of steps that you need to take along the way in order to deliver those cars. So in this example, we're going to say that we need 100 completed cars by the end of the month. In order to get those 100 completed cars, you're kind of not going to expect that you can create them all in the very last day of the month. You know, you're not saving 100 cars to be created on April 30th. What you're really doing is you're kind of working backwards. So you're making sure you're doing the right things in order to deliver these 100 cars. So say in order to get 100 complete cars, that means I actually have to put a battery in and fuel up slightly more than 100 cars because there might be errors along the way. And if I'm filling 102 cars with a battery and fuel, then I'll need 102 cars in joining, and there might be errors in joining. So in the chassis assembly and body assembly, I might need a few extra parts. And you know, this is a car manufacturing process, so these error rates are very low, but the idea is pretty much the same for sales. You kind of need to worry about all of those pieces that go into delivering quota. But the other thing that we learned from supply chain is that they don't worry just about the stages and the pieces, like where these cars are in their production pipeline. They actually worry about the timing as well. And this is like really where we see kind of more companies miss that element of figuring out based on a schedule. You know, I actually am going to have to do this chassis assembly maybe 6 weeks before I can hope to have a completed car. And then the sales process, again, you can draw this up basically the same way. You're going to probably have, again, a few more closed loss deals than these, but the concept is the same. And the timing concept is still the same, where not everything closes at the same time. You might need to start your outbound activities before you start your inbound activities because outbound takes longer to close, for example. So when you take this sort of view of when you need to do these activities and how many you need to do, you get what we are calling the blueprint to quota. So the next part is, okay, great, maybe hopefully you believe what I just shared and you're like, okay, that makes sense, like let me try it out. How are you going to build this blueprint? So at the end of this session, we'll send you guys a Google Sheet. You will not give us your email or anything, so don't worry about it, not gated. Just a simple Google Sheet for you guys to fill out and test this out on your own to see how it might make sense for you and your team. So step one, you're going to input the target quota for each rep and your average sales price and your quota period end date. These are kind of the real basics of your quota. A few tips that we have along the way is don't overthink this. This is a Google Sheet. You can fill these numbers out and change them. Nothing is set in stone. And the second thing that we've seen in our work as we're kind of advising on how you would use the blueprint, create separate versions by sales motion. So if you have a team that is selling both in mid-market and enterprise, and you have a point of view on like how much they're going to close from each of those segments, create separate versions because those segments kind of close and convert very differently. And the averages are really going to kind of lead you to a totally different, probably incorrect path. So once you're giving us the basics of your quota, what you would fill out on your Google Sheet is rename the stages that we've indicated here to match your process, so it's really relevant to you. Indicate the number of days that each deal is in this specific stage. So this is the number of days that it's in the stage until it is either moving forward or marked as lost on average. And then the second thing that you would indicate is the conversion rate from stage to stage. So don't overthink your conversion rates. This is conversion rate from stage to stage. Very simple example here. If you had 50 SQLs and that converts to 10 SQOs, you are going to call that a 20% conversion rate. And then boom, we're going to populate this blueprint for you. And you're going to know based on time periods, how many activities you need, and if you're on track or off track to reaching your quota. One thing to think about as you're looking at this blueprint is how are you actually going to measure timing and progress against this? CRMs don't make stage tracking and stage history all that easy to report on. So it might mean that you're tracking things in a Google Sheet for a while, or that you're adding a few fields to Salesforce.
And Sanj, a question on that. When we think about visibility, visibility breeds accountability, accountability breeds action. Where have you seen folks be successful in getting this information in front of their reps? What are some best practices that you've seen with that?
Yeah, probably the biggest thing is slightly changing pipeline management conversations, where we've worked with a bunch of folks who were having pipeline management conversations that were more around like close date and dollar value instead of like how many deals are actually at play. Like, you know, spoiler, the close, just because you're changing the close date doesn't mean it's going to close or you're more likely to hit quota. But if you have more deals in play, you're more likely to hit quota.
That's a funny fact, right? That's like wish casting, not forecasting. Like, oh, I'll just put the close date this quarter, and maybe it'll happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not a bad thing to do, right? It the psychology of it is if you do change the close date, like it does help you think about, well, if I really think this is going to close by April 30th, what are the steps that I would take to get there? But that is kind of for one deal. It doesn't actually help you holistically think about how you're going to get to this bigger target. The other tip that we have in here, and we can kind of share it, is if you the one great thing that has come out of Salesforce's Lightning experience, which is otherwise horrendous if you're like a Salesforce nerd, is that you can switch to a Kanban view. And viewing your pipeline through that view actually shows you like the number of deals you have in each stage much more clearly than typical Salesforce reporting does. And we can share a few slides on how you can flip to that view at the end of this. Cool. So hopefully you understand what the blueprint is, why it matters, how you can use this sheet to help you build it out. So how are you going to use the blueprint now? Like how do we talked a little bit on how you can report against it, but how are you actually going to use it to coach your team to hitting their targets or coach yourself to hitting your targets? So the first thing to know when you're looking at this blueprint is that people like to win. So we are naturally going to always focus on this 150K number and our progress against the 150K number. The learning, the process, all the stuff that you need to get there is not as fun. It makes a worse story. It's not as fun to think about. It's not as fun to do. So when you're thinking about how you would get your team to behave differently around their pipeline, or how you would get yourself to behave differently around pipeline, you sort of need to keep that in mind, where you don't need to kind of reward yourself for closing a deal more. You need to like reward yourself for staying on track to hitting your number. And more than like the human brain's desire to win and all of the chemical rushes that we get from winning, is that people don't like negative feedback. So in this example, we're saying that you need to have 59 MQLs in order to ultimately close 6 deals. That means 53 deals are going to be lost over this cycle. And knowing that people really don't like negative feedback, there's a natural inclination to kind of circumvent your process. That you would say, this isn't really working. This is a waste of my time. I'm losing so many deals. Why would I even talk to this person? So it's really important to kind of get ahead of that in your management conversations.
But Sanj, kind of in looking at this, why wouldn't we go further down in the funnel and just try to get, put sales engineers on more demos? So that way that sales qualified op to demo rate is 100%. Like, why wouldn't we start a little bit lower and work on those things?
Yeah, that's absolutely an option that you have. But what we've found is that most people don't have like a predictable sales process. So if you think about like that car manufacturing example, like a manufacturing operation is like quite predictable. And when you're improving processes from a supply chain standpoint, you're actually looking for predictability first and then creating an intervention to change that outcome. In most sales processes, we don't even have that like baseline discipline and predictability in order to understand like where is the most impactful place to change our process.
And I want to call a point out and add a little bit of context to what Sanj was saying there. As sales leaders, we have more and more tools at our fingertips to solve, each one of these stage problems. I'm sure there's a tool out there that can help me convert more opportunities to demos or write better proposals and all of that. And that's all wonderful. But what Sanj is hitting on here is really important. You have to have a good process or a good understanding of your process before you can deploy tools effectively. I think the canonical example here is if you have really, really bad email and really, really bad positioning and marketing, and you load that up into a sales engagement tool, now you're just firing off bad email to more people. You've optimized a bad process, so now you're doing a bad thing more quickly. And what's important here, folks, and what Sanj will spend some more time on is, this is really about the process and making sure you've got good understanding of that first, then deploying fixes where it could be technology, it could be training, it could be, hell, maybe you need more people.
Yeah, and I would say like, I'm I'm the kind of heartless former CFO who like looks at numbers and I'm like, what are you talking about? The I'm wasting my time bit is kind of the thing that like certainly when I was CFO, certainly when I was like running sales teams before, it, like really kind of grinds my gears. Like if you are not hitting quota, like literally nothing you're doing is wasting your time. Like you're wasting like everybody's time by not hitting quota. So like really figure out what parts are reproducible, what parts are really lucky, and what parts can you optimize.
And I think that this requires a certain level of intellectual honesty. And Sanj, you and I have talked about this a lot before, where you've got the uneven sales team, right? The sales team's overall attainment is at 90 or 100%, but that's on the back of one gal who's done 300% of quota and everybody's at 30%. Back to what Sanj said before, it was a quick point he made, but averages can disguise and hide a lot of things. That will help you start to uncover these things. You have to be intellectually honest with yourself. You can't hope that we're going to get a blue board every quarter, or Sanj is going to be at 300% and the rest of the team is going to be at 30 and we're going to be okay. This is really about that process and making your revenue machine repeatable, as opposed to just saying like, oh, I'm wasting my time. I'm just going to tag the CEO in early because that worked before, so it'll work now, which is cool. It's just not building a repeatable revenue process. It's building a quick win for a deal, which, yeah.
So what do we do about like overcoming like all of this inclination to not focus on process? Because like, honestly, even as Rich and I were like riffing on like why process matters, like process is boring. Like that last 2 minutes of conversation was boring. So how do we get like our brains back in it? And before we go into like the solution, we're going to try an exercise that hopefully Rich doesn't remember, but we're going to try an exercise with Rich on helping you guys understand how negative feedback actually will impact your team's performance. So Rich, you're our guinea pig here, and everyone on the webinar, please do this along at your desk. I'm going to show you some words. Don't read the word, but say the color of the font out loud.
The color of the font, okay. Red, green, purple.
Great job. You know, you're not colorblind. I guess that's all I've learned from that.
Let me stop here because I feel like I'm ahead of the curve for whatever comes next. Let's just call it good webinar. Yeah. Nice work, Sanj.
No, this is great. Try it again, okay?
Yep. Oh, shit. Blue, green, blue, purple, green, Jesus. Okay, sorry. Purple, red, green. There we go.
Great. You've seen like how tricky we are. So, and hopefully everyone noticed how Rich struggled. He was acting, if you couldn't tell. But the first time Rich did this, he actually didn't say a word because his brain sort of froze up. But now you guys kind of get the activity, you get how tricky we're going to be. Let's try it again.
Font, so I call it a fonts allowed. Green, font. Blue, red.
Right. So this little psychology experiment that we ran through is called a Stroop test. And what a Stroop test does is it kind of gives us mixed signals or mixed cues and sees how our brain processes these mixed cues to get us to an outcome. And through this exercise, there are 3 things that like most of you, if you were kind of playing along at home, would have noticed. It's usually people perform the fastest when the color of the font and the text matched. You know, like where you have kind of harmonized cues and it's really easy to process in. People tend to be slowest in that second example, the first time you see a mismatch, because your brain's like, whoa, that's not what I was expecting. Like that's totally different than what I was thinking. How am I going to solve this problem? Because usually people's first inclination, the thing that you said in your head but didn't say out loud, is the wrong one. And that gives you negative feedback. So that second example gives you that first taste of negative feedback. What happens the third time that you do it, though, is that people tend to be a lot faster. They can kind of see through the text and the font, and you're able to focus your attention to the font color and really ignore the text. And every time you do it after that third time, people tend to get faster to the point that it almost becomes as quick as the very first time when the cues match. And the reason it happens is because your brain actually rewrites the process. That negative feedback forced your brain to figure out a different pathway to get to your outcome. I promise this has something to do with sales. It's not just an interesting psychology thing. So back to our blueprint to Quota, you have these 59 deals that you worked. These are 59 individual Stroop tests, and 53 of them, according to this example, are probably going to lose. That results in 53 individual process rewrites for each salesperson. And if you're wondering now, like, yeah, but these are like probably like really small things that they're changing along the way. If you've ever been in an organization where you redo sales training every 3 to 6 months, this is why. This is really like what losing is doing to your team's brain.
I have a question here, Sanj, and I'm going to put you on the spot with this. Is this something that maybe there's a hack involved here? And I know you'll talk a little bit more about how to make this more of a routine, but is there a hack in here where we celebrate some of these losses?
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. It's not celebrating the loss necessarily, but it's normalizing losses.
Yeah. It's kind of like when you teach somebody how to drive a manual transmission. It's like, okay, cool, Sanj, stall the car. Just get it out of the way now. Okay, cool. That's going to happen at some point in time, but let's get comfortable with that. Like I can see a similarity here.
Yeah, it's really like reframing performance against these targets. So what's interesting about negative feedback is feedback isn't created equally. So a customer telling you no to your face is actually less impactful than your boss telling you, like, don't worry about it, you did the right thing.
Interesting.
So we value the feedback more from people that we're close to and trust and you know who we work with regularly. But there is kind of another hack in here, and probably to the surprise of no one, we're going to say it's compensation. So the real way to break through like this urge to change a process is to build a habit around it. And when you build a habit, it becomes this thing that is like much more ingrained, and it's sort of impervious to feedback. Habits are like extremely, extremely resilient and surprisingly easy to form. So the first thing on building a habit is you need to give a target to the habit you want to build. The second thing is you need kind of a scripted routine. So it's not like the first time you ever saw this. You know, I want to do this. This is how I get there. So in the case of, you know, I want 59 MQLs. I get to those 59 MQLs by following this outreach sequence and follow-up pattern, or use this prospecting lens. But the final piece of forming habits, you can have a target, you can have the routine, you can hit a target, but it doesn't stick unless you have a reward. Your brain needs some sort of consequence to prove that the routine was worth it, and the chemical release that you get with the reward commits that to memory. So the takeaway of it is you need to start paying on pipeline metrics. And to do that, you have 3 key elements. You have the quota, so you're setting targets around these pipeline metrics and holding people to those targets. You have the playbook, so people know how they're supposed to achieve those targets. So like, what set of activities do I need to do to get an SQO? And then finally, you have the commission. So like really clear points that you're paying people on. And what you're paying people on is whether they win or lose. This is what's really different from like kind of the typical view of commissions. It's you're paying them on the activity. You're not worried about how it actually converts forward. It's just that they went through the motion. And by doing all of these things, you're actually saying like, you're kind of normalizing the loss in the process. Yeah. Sorry, guys. So in this case, if you're paying on each of these 25 SQLs, it doesn't matter whether they convert to SQO or if they're ultimately lost. You're holding people to the process, and that's removing any notion of negative feedback. What do you think about that, Rich?
Yeah, every time, I mean, we've worked together so many times. Every time I hear it, it's still, there's this part of my brain that's like, but no, that's not how we pay salespeople, Sanj. The part here that's really always enlightening for me when I get to chat with other organizations that aren't thinking as forward as Sanj and team are, when they deploy these sorts of changes, it does actually start to have some impact, where you're focusing on the process and not the outcome. And it's not to say the outcome is not important, but one of the challenges, especially if you go through like trying to hire and trying to promote and trying to grow your sales organization, you always have, or it's often a trope where you have the rep that does everything wrong and is ahead of quota consistently. And they think that they're amazing and they're just really lucky, but they're kind of a pain in the ass. The sales engineers don't want to work with that person. The deals that they hand over to customer success are terrible. This process adherence and process related compensation starts to solve for some of that. That dysfunctional, high-performing salesperson, and it snaps the team into a mode where it is executionally and operationally efficient and excellent, much like that assembly line. Versus just rewarding when cars end up in the lot. And it's like, oh, cool, we got 9 new Teslas today. Wasn't expecting that.
You know, it doesn't even need to be kind of like the story of the one dysfunctional rep. It could be the one rep that everyone just needs to copy their process, like the one really functional rep. And we've seen it like really clearly with our work. We worked with one customer who has 10 BDRs, and they only had 1 BDR hitting their meetings quota each month, and 9 who are performing to maybe like 30% of quota, like abysmally. And when we worked with them to look at their data, we were just seeing like, guess what? The person who was hitting quota actually was sending prospecting messages to twice as many accounts as the average rep was touching. So they introduced an incentive to just find the right accounts and start communicating with those accounts. And 2 months later, 8 people are hitting quota now.
It's funny, those little tweaks, and I feel like too, this is topical as well as we start to plan for a post, I don't want to say post-pandemic, but we come out of a little bit of the hibernation that we've been in, or some of us have been in for the past year. It's important too, because it gives you a little bit of resiliency as well from a planning standpoint, right? I can look at this and say, and I know there was a couple questions that we got during registration, but it's like, how do we plan to triple, double, and how do we plan to grow our business? And a lot of it starts with having a good understanding of what the sales motion is, looking at having the data and collecting that and getting good feedback as early on, and then rewarding for process adherence, as well as for making sure you're getting the outcomes that you're looking for here.
Yeah, and I think the classic triple, double formula is like you throw more bodies at it. But actually, like you don't need to throw that many bodies at it if you actually figure out your formula.
Right, and I think the other part on that as well as you can unlock all different sorts of, especially if you look at each one of these as like mini assembly lines, there may be optimizations that you can make that is, to Sanjay's point, right? It could be technology, it could be process, it could be enablement. It's not just the mythical, in engineering, right, Sanj, the mythical man month, where if we just throw more engineers on the project, it's going to ship faster, right? And that's how you end up with Windows Vista. You can't do that with sales in all instances. You can't just hire double the number of salespeople, double the quota, and somehow it will math its way to a conclusion. It might work, but this allows you to check and say, do we need that many reps or do we need half as many? And we just make them twice as productive because we get them to focus on a little bit further up in the process versus just on the closing component.
Right. And the other thing, so we've talked a lot about like, hey, if you do these things, you're going to hit quota. But if you do these things every month, every quarter, you actually are going to hit quota every month and every quarter. Like the predictability aspect of this is like really, really huge. Like we've worked with one of our customers and looked at their data, and we could see like these 4 salespeople were your best salespeople last quarter. They're all going to close 0 this quarter. And we could just see from their numbers that they didn't have enough deals in play. And what we worked with them on implementing is they actually now have an opportunity creation incentive. It's small, but significant. And across their 20 AEs, if they close one more deal as a result of this incentive, it pays for the incentive for the full year.
Right.
These are like really, you don't have to put a lot of money behind these, but they're highly, highly effective and they're highly, highly accretive.
Well, and I think there's a lot there, Sanj, and there's a bunch of good registration questions. I just want to give a shout out to the audience as well. We've got Sanj for about another 15, 20 minutes or so. Obviously incredibly brilliant on both the math here and the psychology behind it. Please do drop any questions you have in the Q&A panel, and we'll start to get to those in a few minutes. But one thing, Sanj, that comes up a lot, and we see this in MSP, right? We've got a mix of company sizes. We've got folks that are just starting out, folks that are maybe product market fit, but don't necessarily have that motion honed. And then folks that are on the, we need to triple, right? We're rocking and rolling now. When you're getting going, maybe you're opening a new vertical, or maybe you're just figuring out your sales motion. How do you recommend kind of building that blueprint? What are some best practices for organizations that are just getting started with a motion?
Yeah, so when, I can give our very clear example. When we hired our first AE, I made up the numbers. I was like, I don't know, try doing this. Can you do all of these things? And then we kind of refined our process, refined our target setting. And, say 6 months later, we're in a place where we never imagined we could have been. And it's all because we were kind of measuring the right activity and we could see patterns happening month over month. And we introduced 2 interventions that have just kind of taken off. But we couldn't have known that we were intervening in the right way if we didn't know that that first piece of it was really predictable.
I think that's a great point in there. And I think the other part too, and Sanj was very transparent with that, right? This is a recovering CFO, who's now a CEO of a company, kind of taking a guess and just being, again, back to being intellectually honest with yourself and about your business. Just like, it's a guess, it's an informed guess, but it's a guess. And capture that information to make sure that you've got an understanding of what's going on stage to stage and start to develop a more informed hypothesis versus a guess there. And first live question that we have coming in here. Sanj, you had talked about a little bit about the BDR example. What data are you pulling in to understand who's doing the right amount of work to make sure that you're kind of incentivizing the right sort of behaviors? That's the first part of the question.
Yeah, so in that BDR example, we had them pull a report from Outreach, and we looked at the number of accounts that they touched every month. It was like, this reporting is like all very available. Like you work with what you got, but when you looked at by person, the number of accounts that were being touched, it was extremely obvious. what was happening and how to change that performance curve.
That's great. Use the data that you got and make some decisions on that. Sanj,
Yeah.
I know this. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I would say like there are, there are a few things to look out for there. There are going to be certain cases where like it's really idiosyncratic. This like one person is particularly good in this one vertical, and like you'll struggle to reproduce that even if you like kind of arbitrarily increase volume or something. So a lot of this analysis we try to do at the individual level, so we understand like how do we get each individual to quota, and everyone's path might look a little bit different because people are actually really good at different sales stages. I shouldn't probably say, I'm really bad at negotiating. I'm just like, I don't know, sign the contract. Please don't talk to me anymore.
I can confirm. I've sold to Sanj, I think 3 or 4 times, and he's not too tough of a negotiator.
But where I'm really good in a technical demo, I know a lot about commissions. So my strength in conversion is probably in a pretty specific place in our pipeline. And therefore, my path to quota would look really different than someone else's.
No, I think that's an interesting point. And Sanj, I do want to ask. This is, I know, one of your favorite questions to answer as a recovering or former CFO and current CEO and co-founder. How do you, as a sales leader, push back on senior management about unrealistic expectations? What are some tips? And that's related to quota here, because oftentimes you just get a number from the board and it's insane. So how have you seen, or what is an effective strategy to push back on that to the best of your ability?
Yeah, let me kind of take us back. So honestly, if you think your quota is totally unrealistic, show your work of how you got there. Where in this process are you constrained? So it could be like, well, we can never get to 6 wins because like we don't have enough sales engineers to do 10 demos in a month. Like that's impossible. And if you can prove with your data that it is impossible, then like the real question is not really, is it possible or not possible? It's really, do we have the investment to kind of prop up the weakest areas? And if not, we're just not going to get that number.
Right. Yeah, hope is not a strategy in that case, and I think it's an important point that Sanj is making there. Like we can do anything, right? But here's what we need to get there. I think that's an important part of that conversation for executives to have. Like we need to get to 200 SQLs per seller to be able to achieve the $50 million revenue goal or whatever it might be.
Right. And, I would say hope is a strategy. It's just like one that succeeds very, very infrequently.
10% of the time it works every single time, Sanj.
Yeah, it's a low probability strategy. But you can try hope. I don't know.
One other question that comes up a lot when we talk about quotas and making adjustments to quotas and some of the compensation work. Any best practices for folks that maybe are thinking about making changes, and not insofar as what should they change, but actually how do they roll that out to the sales team so that the sellers aren't like, oh man, another comp plan, they're trying to screw me again. How do you frame changes to compensation plans to the sales team?
Yeah, so when you're thinking about rolling out these pipeline incentives, there are kind of two sort of levels of pushback that we typically see. One is on the finance side, right? So it's like, well, how are you going to take this out of people's base rates? Our recommendation is these types of incentives should be pretty small, and they're extremely ROI positive. So you don't really need to take this out of someone's OTE. You can add it on top, have it be no more than an estimated 10% of what they would otherwise make on their commission plan. And then you're trying to get to the metrics of like, hey, if we close 3 more deals, 4 more deals from this, then we'll cover the whole incentive itself. the other, so, aside from like the finance side, can we actually afford it? How much should it be? The other piece of pushback or the other issue to manage is, especially if you have extremely senior sellers, they sort of like bristle at this idea that someone is telling them what process metrics that they need to hit. Our recommendation on that is like, you kind of frame this as like, hey, this is really important for the company to gather data at this stage, because we'll use this data to influence the product roadmap or influence marketing and ultimately make you more efficient. But we try to position these as like data gathering, because when you're going to pay on process, what you want to do is kind of pay on some sort of data or fields that they're filling out along the way to help you understand why something converted or didn't.
Right. And I think that an important part of that too goes all the way back to the hiring process, right? If you're taking a data-driven approach to a lot of these things, make sure you're interviewing for folks that aren't going to bristle too much at those things. Sanj, a couple more good questions coming in here. We spent a lot of time talking about just kind of that blueprint and looking at getting the SQL goal or SQO goal. What about in situations where maybe I do everything right by the process and still don't close enough deals, or still don't close any deals? What have you seen happen in that world?
So go through all of this, and then you end up with a big goose egg. So you've hit all the milestones along the way. That can happen, right? Like, you're operating on the law of averages. But if you have enough deals in play, it's really unlikely to happen unless there's something significantly wrong in the process. So that's when you would kind of go through and figure out, how could we have figured out these things we're going to lose sooner?
Yep.
Where was kind of like the worst part of the process? Did we just change our prospecting and start getting the wrong people? Did we change how we're doing demos? So there are a few, that's when you really can interrogate the process, but that would be based on kind of a few periods of data. You wouldn't want to just base that on like, oh, I had one bad month or quarter. This won't necessarily break through those slumps that you might hit, but it's really unlikely you would get to zero if you're kind of hitting all these milestones along the way.
Yeah, and especially over a long enough period of time. Back to that law of averages, like it'll average out. Maybe you have a bad month and then a good month or something like that.
Yep.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. Well, we've got Sanj for just a few more minutes here. Any other questions? Please do throw those in the Q&A panel here. But Sanj,
I'll go into my wrap up then and give like a few takeaways for people. While we're waiting if there are any other questions. So, these are just kind of bonus tips on like how you can use this to guide your conversations. A lot of pipeline management conversations. So like we're a commissions company, we're talking about like pipeline and process. We're talking about like the types of conversations you should have. This is all feedback that's really integrated to how you're going to build habits on your team. So we try to understand how people are talking about their pipeline. And one thing that we've observed is people don't really talk about pipeline management. Most conversations are really around forecasting. People are talking about close dates and amounts. And that's not going to be the thing that helps your team build resilience through this process and build the right habits that ultimately lead to quota. So, the questions that you should be asking are like, oh, do you think we're doing the right things to help you hit your MQL goal? What else can we do to supplement your pipe? Or where do you think we can optimize this process? Because it seems like you're not going to hit your SQO goal. The other recommendation that we have is, you're going to try to build your conversation bottom up. So like, don't have a standard template for everyone on your team. It's really like meet that rep where they are. And talk about the number of activities. Like, so don't worry about the dollar amount so much. If you have this predictable business that we're trying to build, it's really around activities. So do you have the right number of opportunities at play to hit your number? And then finally, like in your CRM, like like train yourself to stop staring at amount and close date, train yourself to start looking at the number of opportunities, the stage, and you know, any exit criteria that you have to move from that stage to the next one or to lose it.
Oh, there's a whole session to be had on that last bullet point. These are all phenomenal. The thing I'll add to this too is really have a definition of when you create an opportunity, when you advance it, and when you close lost it. Don't just let stuff hang out in Deadwood with hope casting. It's not going to work for a lot of what Sanj was talking about here.
Yep. So, or you know, if you've hopefully we've made a compelling case for how you can use your pipeline more effectively to drive performance and predictability. But the three things are, remember to build this blueprint. You can use our sheet, but if you don't want to use our sheet, build your own blueprint. Tell people exactly what they need to do to hit quota. And if you can't answer that question, it's like pretty unfair and unreasonable to expect your reps to hit quota. The second thing is think about how you can add these incentives along the pipeline to form habits. And you know, we talk about building this as an integrated part of your comp plan. You can roll this out as a spiff and try it out for 2 or 3 months if you want to. And then the final piece is like review your pipeline conversations and try to be intentional about the times you're talking about forecasting, because that is an important exercise, but like box your forecasting conversations to only be about the forecasting side.
I think this was really, really great stuff, Sanj. I really appreciate these conversations. I think that every time we have you on, it's always an amazing mix of really practical, actionable tactics and some of the psychology of how we think as humans. And this session was yet another of that. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your insight and your expertise with the MSP community. On behalf of Hannah and the team behind the scenes, everybody in the community watching this on YouTube in the future, and all of the folks that attended here live today, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We really, really appreciate it, Sanj.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Awesome. Stay safe. Take care, everyone.